Well, good afternoon, or whenever anybody is going to access this video. Hopefully other people join in today. I would love to have some company, but if not, this is going to serve as sort of a resource to help explain what's going on in some of these videos. And I thought this might be a little bit helpful since this lecture doesn't have any written text involved in it, so it requires you to watch the videos. So we're looking at the women's suffrage movement here, a movement that took place, as the lecture link indicates, from 1848 to 1920. That's, if you do the math real quick, that is about 72 years, right? This is about a 4-generation movement, which is both discouraging and encouraging in different aspects. It's discouraging because it takes so long, and the people that originally launched this movement were dead and buried when they achieved victory finally in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. It's encouraging. Hey, Raul, nice for you to join. We're already got started, so chime in if you have any questions going forward. I'm just sort of giving an introduction right now, and just going over some of the broad aspects of this lecture. So it's encouraging for anybody, and this includes you viewing this, if you ever get involved in anything political, trying to enact change in this society, in this country, in your community. This is something this is a historical lesson that you can kind of lean on, that change is slow, right? And appealing to people's logic is not necessarily going to enact change, right? People who are brought up to believe, in this case, in women's suffrage, which was, the denial of granting women the right to vote in this country for most of its history, was ingrained in them early on, right? And this goes back generations in history, for thousands of years, that women just politically cannot handle, emotionally cannot handle politics, constitutionally cannot handle politics, right? That's ingrained, and it was very difficult to change that mindset for people. And this is in part why it's going to take about 4 generations. There's other factors behind that, but that's part of it. And, the logic is sound. You would think the logic is sound. And, what is it they're fighting for? They're fighting for the right to vote. And what's the logic to back that up? Well, if you are being subjected by a government where you have to abide by the laws, you have to pay taxes, you should be able to participate in that government. At the very least, you should be able to vote for or against people enacting laws that either represent your interest or go against your interest. And so a lot of these women are basically pointing out that logic. And it's not going to sink in because, again, the idea of what made women, the gender of women at this time, was that they were subjected by men, and the institutions that men have created, and all they need to do is fall in line and to uphold their gender roles within society, which was taking care of their husband, raising children, and whatnot, right? So what we're going to do today is go through some of the videos. I would highly recommend reading through this introduction just to provide kind of a framework as you're going through the videos. So they kind of make sense, and this will help kind of navigate, what's going to be coming up as you go through. There's a helpful introduction material right here that you can take a look at. But what we're going to do today is we're going to go through at least 2 of these videos, and I'm going to play them, and I'll push pause here and there and provide, just kind of underscore and react to what's going on in these videos. It's just basically kind of carving up a documentary before you watch the film Iron-Jawed Angels. So let's begin. Let me open this on up, stop share. Okay, and now we're going to go back to share. Go to advanced, go to video. And okay, excellent. So we'll start with the introduction. This is learning objective 1. identify, and you might want to jot this down while you're watching the video so you know what it is that you're going to be taking notes on. But basically, learning objective 1 is identify when, where, and by whom did the women's suffrage movement begin. Explain the reaction to the initial movement. What did certain suffragists think about such negative reactions? So without further ado, let's get started and take a look at what's going on here.
(1913). Washington had never seen anything like it. "8,000 women from all over the country flooding down Pennsylvania Avenue, demanding the right to vote."
Sorry, take note of that name, Alice Paul. So if you've not heard of this person before, she is going to provide the leadership of the last 8 years of the women's suffrage movement. She's young, right? She's newly out of college. And we'll be reintroduced to her throughout this video. And she's the protagonist of the film Iron-Jawed Angels. So just take note of her. Just want to make sure that that didn't slip by you.
"It is absurd," said one delegate, "half the citizens in America keeping the other half from the ballot."
We shall strive and we shall conquer, hard though the fight may be. And with hearts ne'er weak or weary, we'll win from sea to sea.
Leading the parade, a lawyer named Inez Milholland. 3 years later, she died of exhaustion campaigning for the cause.
And you'll see that depicted in the film Iron-Jawed Angels, and Inez Milholland, who was a leader during this. And take note, sometimes I think students will develop a response to this learning objective and state that the movement began in 1913. And what they're not doing is watching the rest of the video. So the documentary is just opening up, talking about where the final years of this movement began, right? And what it's going to do in just a couple of seconds here is go back to the beginning of the movement. But what you're seeing here is the last leg of this movement, 8 years left before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And the movement is accelerated largely due to the leadership of young women at this time, like Inez Milholland or Alice Paul or Lucy Byrne during this time. And again, this is couched 1913. This represents something you're studying in this unit, Unit 3, the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is a reaction to the destructive nature of the Industrial Revolution, where people got involved in politics at all levels, the community, the state, and federal level, to enact all sorts of reforms: child labor, minimum wage, job safety, and women's suffrage is one of many issues that people got involved in a very, very conspicuous way. Take note, this parade that's happening, it's right before President Wilson's inauguration. President Wilson is the last president of the Progressive Era. He's going to be the president that gets the United States involved in World War I. So take note of that. This would have been very strange, right? We're very used to people showing up to Washington today, whoever they are, right? Men, women, people of color, white people, conservatives, liberals, right? This was not the norm, and especially not the norm for women in a public way to protest the federal government in this way. And doing it at a time when the spotlight should have been on, from the perspective of institutions, President Wilson, who was about to get inaugurated into the office of the President of the United States of America.
One delegation, dressed as pilgrims, had marched 400 miles from New York City, led by General Rosalie Jones.
We are marching on to victory, coming in our eyes, for our causes rise.
reaction from the crowd was mixed. Some men jeered. One yelled, "Go home to your mother." The marcher yelled back, "My mother is here." Women new to the battle, some who had fought for decades. By 1913, the movement had millions of supporters. But on that blustery day, there were few who could remember how it all began, 65 years before, in Seneca Falls, New York.
To just state the obvious, now the documentary is depicting the beginning of the movement, 1848, Seneca Falls. And you're going to be introduced to somebody named Elizabeth Cady Stanton here.
In 1848, this was a progressive town, in the heart of the anti-slavery movement. But the women of Seneca Falls were as confined as any in the land. Second-class citizens restricted by law and custom.
Once a woman married, everything that she owned became her husband's. They ceased to exist legally. Women had no rights to their own property, they had no rights to their children, they had no rights to the safety of their own bodies. One of the states upheld the right of a husband to beat his wife, saying that to do otherwise would be to upset the domestic harmony of the home.
Those who dared suggest that women were entitled to equal rights were accused of blasphemy. It was in this climate that the first...
So just to, we saw in text what that was talking about. I just want to underscore that. What they're talking about here is this was a legal term. You were considered legally dead once you were married. So any property you brought to the marriage, children you had in the marriage weren't legally yours in any meaningful way, right? And so if you were in an abusive relationship, which was quite common back then, and you needed to leave the marriage, you were leaving any property brought to the marriage, you were leaving your children, right? If your husband chose to say, I'm going to keep these children, yeah, so these would be very difficult choices for women. And most women faced with those choices, obviously, would just have to endure the abuse, given that they're not going to want to leave their children at this time.
Women's rights meeting was called at a modest chapel in Seneca Falls. The leader, 32-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton, did not look like a revolutionary, but Stanton had been a rebel since childhood. A judge's daughter, she had fought for an education as good as her brother's. Now the wife of a radical abolitionist, Stanton was pushing the fight beyond slavery to demand justice for women as well.
The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man toward woman.
To take note of that, we'll in a later video, they'll talk about, I think, Learning Objective 2, they'll talk about the origins of this movement. A lot of the early suffragists, as they are going to be known during this movement, were abolitionists, right? What is an abolitionist? An abolitionist, this is the time in 1848, this is the time when slavery is legal. And so you had this movement that had begun in the early 1800s to abolish slavery. And so people who wanted to abolish slavery were abolitionists, right? And so a lot of the people involved in that movement, abolitionists, were women. And and we'll go into more detail on this in a later video, but what a lot of women began to realize, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were adamantly against the institution of slavery and wanted to see it abolished, is nobody was taking them seriously because they were women. And what they recognize is until they had political rights, until they had the right to vote, issues like the abolition of slavery were going to be mired. They were going to be inhibited from ever being enacted until the people in the movement had political rights. themselves.
Having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her.
For 2 days, the Methodist chapel rang with the voices of 300 women and 40 men, most of them abolitionists already calling for the end of slavery. Now they raise some of the most troubling issues to women: divorce, education, property rights, passing one resolution after the next. Then the assembly was thrown into an uproar by Stanton's demand that women be given the right to vote.
For what shall we first petition? For the exercise of our right to the elective franchise. Nothing short of this. The grant of this right will secure all the others.
That was the only thing that was controversial among them. It was so radical. It was such a quintessentially male act by 1848 to vote that they really had to argue among themselves about whether it was okay to put that in, whether that would sink the whole thing.
Women couldn't, by law, vote. But by and large, what was at stake here wasn't just law, but it was a whole set of customs and assumptions about the way the world was supposed to be, about what men and women were supposed to be. It was only men, mostly white men, who had the right to vote.
The debate over women's suffrage went on for hours, until abolitionist Frederick Douglass rose in support.
This cause is not exclusively woman's cause. It is the cause of human brotherhood, as well as human sisterhood.
The Seneca Falls Declaration called for the vote in a true democracy where male and female, black and white, would stand together on equal ground. Reaction to the convention was swift. One paper called it an insurrection, another, a congregation of Amazons bolting with a vengeance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was delighted.
My dear friends, I see that all the journals from Maine to Texas strive with each other to see which can make our movement seem more ridiculous. Imagine all the publicity given to our ideas. It will start women thinking, and men too. And when men and women think, the first step in progress is taken. Good night.
All right, so that is the first video of this series. Let me stop share there. Excellent. Raul and Tanya, excellent. Glad you could join me. If you have any questions about that video that we just watched, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on it, but just wanted to open it up to any of you viewing this right now. Any questions or need for clarification there? Based on the learning objective, again, the learning objective is identify when, where, and by whom did the women's suffrage movement begin, explain the reaction of the initial movement, and what did the certain suffragists think about such negative reactions. So one thing to take note of, and please interrupt me here if you do have questions, but one thing to keep in mind here is that at the Seneca Falls Convention, yeah, they were going over all sorts of issues: the right to divorce, the right to your children, a right to education, a right to vocations, professional trades. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is always she's gonna be involved in this movement through 1848 all the way up to the late 1800s, up until her death, really. She's always pushing the envelope. And at this convention itself, she's calling for the right to vote. And the people there organizing the event, helping Elizabeth Cady Stanton, organizing, providing equal leadership, were quite upset about this, right? And it wasn't as if they didn't believe they should have the right to vote. It's they understood that the reaction to this was going to be harsh, and all of those other issues wouldn't be taken seriously, given how extreme the views were at this time. But as the video pointed out, one of the people in attendance was Frederick Douglass, probably the most well-known abolitionist at this time, is going to back up the right, this call for the right to vote for women at this time. And the argument is basically, hey, all of these other issues, they're great. The right to divorce, the right to higher education, the right to the professional trades, right from protection from abusive spouses. All of those things are equally important to the right to vote, but we're not going to get any of those things until we, the women at this convention and women all throughout the United States at this time, have the right to vote. And predictably, as some of the people that were a little bit concerned about publicizing their desire for suffrage, the right to vote, the reaction was swift and it was very harsh. And you could take note of some of the direct quotes from newspapers at this time about these women, about them being Amazonian and all of that kind of stuff. But what Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw this was welcome it, right? We're not going to change people's views overnight. We're in this for the long haul. I think she was a little bit shocked about how long it actually took, but she realized that this was going to take a number of years, possibly decades. It's going to get the ball rolling, right? And so what she is envisioning that happened is, people all over the world, they're going to be all over the country, they're going to be opening up their newspapers, and obviously you're going to have men reading these newspapers and huffing and puffing, yelling about how these ridiculous women, these ridiculous liberals from New York, from the New England area, are trying to get the right to vote and pounding, the table, and damn these women, right? And maybe, perhaps, there might be his daughter, a 6-7-year-old girl sitting in the corner, listening to her father and doing what all kids kind of do. Why? Why can't women have the right to vote? And again, as pointed out at the beginning of this talk, the logic is pretty sound. If you are subjected to the laws, if you have to pay taxes in a representative government as an adult, despite your gender role, why shouldn't you have the right to vote? But again, what we're talking about is a structure and mindset that had been going on for decades. So Raul, Tanya, let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to go on to the next video if you don't. Let me go to the learning objective prompt here. And again, let me know if you have any questions, but if not, we'll go on. But yeah, take note of this. I'm going to stop record and then I'll record again. But that way we'll have several, could break this up a little bit here.